The restaurant was called Lunar, one of those places where reservations required 3 months' notice and a willingness to spend what most people earned in a week. Victoria Ashford had chosen it carefully. Not because she cared about Michelin stars or the chef's pedigree, but because Lunar had private dining rooms, rooms with doors that closed, rooms where her 7-year-old daughter wouldn't be stared at. Victoria adjusted the diamond bracelet on her wrist, Cartier, a gift to herself after closing the Chen acquisition, and checked her reflection in the car window. Charcoal Armani suit, tailored to perfection. Louboutin heels that added 3 inches to her 5'6" frame. Hair in a sleek chignon that had taken her stylist 40 minutes to perfect. She looked like what she was, the founder and CEO of Ashford Technologies, a woman who'd built a billion-dollar empire from a Stanford dorm room and $20,000 in student loans. She looked like someone in control. "Ready, sweetheart?" Victoria signed to her daughter through the car window. Inside, 7-year-old Grace sat perfectly still, her small hands folded in her lap. She wore a navy velvet dress that Victoria had spent an hour selecting, expensive but understated, pretty but not attention-seeking. Her dark hair was pulled into neat braids, secured with ribbons that matched the dress exactly. She looked like a tiny adult, carefully packaged to blend into a world that Victoria knew would judge them both. Grace nodded, her brown eyes solemn. Too solemn for 7. But that was what happened when your mother spent 6 years teaching you that being deaf was something to hide, manage, contain. Something to be handled in private dining rooms instead of celebrated in public spaces. They walked through Lunar's main dining area, all exposed Edison bulbs and reclaimed wood, the kind of calculated industrial chic that tech founders and venture capitalists performed the theater of billion-dollar deals over $30 appetizers. A woman at a nearby table glanced at Grace, then quickly away. Victoria's jaw tightened. She knew that look. The flicker of curiosity followed by deliberate avoidance. The social calculus that said acknowledging a disabled child was awkward, better to pretend she didn't exist. The private dining room was exactly as promised. Isolated, quiet, safe. Victoria had brought Grace here a dozen times over the past year. Their mother-daughter dinners, she called them. Quality time, she told herself. But really, they were performances of normalcy. Rehearsals for a relationship that Victoria was terrified she was failing at. Because the truth Victoria spent every waking moment trying to outrun, was that she'd considered not keeping Grace when the diagnosis came at 18 months. Had sat in a genetic counselor's office, newly divorced and building a startup that required 18-hour days, and listened to options. Early intervention programs, cochlear implants, foster care specializing in special needs children, adoption agencies that placed deaf children with deaf families who could give them what Victoria couldn't, fluency in a language she didn't speak, acceptance in a community she didn't belong to, a mother who saw deafness as identity instead of obstacle. She'd kept Grace, had hired the best therapists, the most expensive speech coaches, the top-rated nannies who knew ASL, had learned basic signs herself, enough to communicate needs, enough to function, never enough to truly connect. And she'd built walls around them both. Private schools that accommodated Grace's needs, private cars to avoid public transportation, private dining rooms to avoid public judgment. She'd protected Grace from a world that might reject her, and in doing so, had taught her daughter that she was something to be hidden. Before we continue, tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from. We love knowing how far these stories of hope and resilience travel. Your comments inspire us to keep bringing you powerful narratives every week.
They'd been sitting in the private room for 20 minutes, Victoria scrolling through emails on her phone, Grace coloring with the expensive markers Victoria always brought to restaurants, when the door opened. A waiter entered, followed by a man Victoria didn't recognize, and a small boy, maybe 9, wearing a bright yellow t-shirt with a dinosaur on it. The man looked harassed, apologetic. He was younger than Victoria, mid-30s maybe, with dark hair that needed cutting and the kind of worn jeans that suggested he hadn't known Lunar's dress code existed. "I'm so sorry," the waiter was saying, in that particular tone of service industry panic. "There was a mix-up with the reservations. This room was double-booked. I can move you to—" "We specifically requested this room," Victoria interrupted, her voice cold. She'd perfected that voice, the one that made junior executives stammer and board members reconsider their positions. 3 months ago. I have the confirmation email." "I understand, Miss Ashford, but—" "No," Victoria said flatly. "You clearly don't understand. I reserved this room for privacy. That was the entire point. I'm not interested in being relocated to some table in the main dining area where—" She stopped herself, glanced at Grace, who was watching with those 2 solemn eyes. "Where we'll be disturbed by noise and crowds. This is unacceptable." The man in jeans spoke up, his voice quieter than Victoria expected. "It's okay. We can go somewhere else. Marco, it's fine. We don't need—" But Marco had already seen Grace, and his small hands were moving in fluid, rapid signs that Victoria only partially understood. The boy's face lit up with excitement, and he was signing to Grace before anyone could stop him. Grace's coloring marker dropped, her eyes went wide, and then, for the first time Victoria could remember, her daughter smiled. Not the polite, practiced smile Victoria had taught her for photographs and board dinners. A real smile, huge and genuine and absolutely radiant. Grace signed back, her small hands flying with an enthusiasm Victoria had never seen. "Your daughter is deaf?" the man asked Victoria, and there was no pity in his voice, just simple acknowledgement. "Yes," Victoria said stiffly, "which is why we need the private room. The noise in the main area makes it difficult for her to—" She trailed off because she realized mid-sentence that she was lying. The noise didn't bother Grace. The noise didn't bother Grace at all. The noise bothered Victoria. "Marco's deaf too," the man said, and Victoria noticed for the first time the cochlear implant barely visible beneath the dark curls of the boy. "We requested this room because he likes being able to see everyone's faces when we eat. Makes following conversations easier. But honestly," he looked at his son, who was now signing animatedly with Grace, both children giggling at something Victoria couldn't understand, "I think he'd rather stay here and talk to someone his own age. Would you mind if we shared the room? I promise we'll be quiet." Victoria opened her mouth to refuse. This was not the plan. The plan was private, controlled, safe. The plan was protecting Grace from exactly this kind of situation, being put on display, being the deaf kid, being different. But Grace was looking at her with such hope, such desperate pleading hope, and Victoria realized with a sharp stab of shame that this was the first time Grace had ever met another deaf child. In 7 years, Victoria had been so focused on teaching Grace to exist in the hearing world that she had never introduced her to the deaf one. "Fine," Victoria heard herself say. "You can stay." The man smiled, genuine, warm, the kind of smile that suggested he hadn't learned to weaponize his expressions yet. "Thank you. I'm Ethan Wright. This is my son Marco. Victoria Ashford. My daughter is Grace." "I know who you are," Ethan said, settling into a chair across from Victoria, while both children immediately returned to their animated signing. "Ashford Technologies. You gave the keynote at TechCrunch last year. It was brilliant." Victoria waited for the rest, the pitch, the ask, the reason someone would bring up her professional life in a social setting. But Ethan just pulled out a worn paperback and started reading, occasionally glancing up to check on Marco. This man, whoever he was, had just recognized her as a billionaire tech CEO and then gone back to reading a book, as if her wealth and power were barely worth commenting on. Victoria didn't know whether to be offended or intrigued.
The children had been signing to each other for 15 minutes. Victoria had tried to follow, caught fragments about dinosaurs and a playground and something about a teacher, but they were using signs she didn't know, grammar structures she'd never learned. They were speaking a language that was fully theirs, complete and complex, and Victoria was on the outside looking in. It was the most animated she'd ever seen Grace. Her daughter's entire body was engaged, hands flying, face expressive in ways Victoria had spent years teaching her to suppress, because hearing people found it too much, because we use our inside voices even when signing. Grace was laughing, a sound Victoria rarely heard because Grace had been taught to be quiet, to not draw attention, to minimize her difference. Watching her daughter be so completely herself was beautiful and heartbreaking in equal measure. "They're talking about video games," Ethan said quietly, not looking up from his book. "Marco's trying to convince Grace that Minecraft is better than Roblox. He's losing." Victoria turned to him sharply. "You understand them? That fast?" "Marco's first language is ASL. I learned it when he was a baby. Went full immersion, took classes, joined deaf community groups, made sure he grew up bilingual. He can speak and hear with the implant, but we sign at home. It's important he has both." "Both," Victoria repeated, the word tasting strange. She'd spent 6 years focused on one, on making sure Grace could lip read, could approximate speech, could function in the hearing world. The idea that Grace could have both, that deafness could be an identity instead of just an obstacle, felt simultaneously obvious and revolutionary. "How much ASL do you know?" Ethan asked, and there was no judgment in the question, just curiosity. "Basic," Victoria admitted. "Enough to communicate needs. I've been busy building a company. There's never enough time to—" She stopped because she heard how defensive she sounded, how much she was making excuses. "It's hard," Ethan said, and his voice was genuinely kind. "Learning a language as an adult, especially when you're successful in the hearing world, everyone tells you that your child needs to adapt to you, instead of suggesting you might need to adapt to them." Victoria felt something crack in her chest. That's exactly what happened. The therapists, the doctors, they all said early intervention, speech therapy, mainstreaming into hearing schools. Nobody said, learn ASL fluently, join the deaf community, let your daughter be deaf instead of trying to make her less so. "Nobody told me either," Ethan admitted. "I figured it out the hard way. Spent Marco's first 2 years forcing speech therapy, trying to make him normal. Then I met his teacher, deaf woman, brilliant educator. She asked me, why was I trying to fix something that wasn't broken? Why was I treating Marco's deafness like a problem instead of a difference? And I realized I was so focused on what Marco couldn't do that I'd never celebrated what he could do." "What changed?" Victoria asked. "I learned ASL," Ethan said simply. "Really learned it. Not just signs, but culture, community, identity. I took a leave of absence from my job. I was a financial analyst, made decent money, but nothing like your level. And I spent 6 months doing nothing but learning my son's language. And when I came back, everything was different. Marco was different because I was different. He went from a frustrated kid who felt broken to a happy kid who felt understood." Victoria looked at Grace, who was showing Marco something on her tablet. Both children bent over the screen with identical expressions of concentration. "I don't have 6 months. I run a company. I have responsibilities, board meetings, international deals." "You have a daughter who's 7 years old and doesn't know you can really talk to her," Ethan interrupted gently. "I'm not judging. I did the same thing. Put career first, convinced myself that providing financially was the same as being present. But Marco needed a father who could understand him more than he needed a father who could afford private school." The waiter appeared with menus. Victoria ordered for herself and Grace.
She always ordered for Grace because reading menus took too long and servers got impatient. But notice that Ethan handed Marco the menu and let him point to what he wanted, let him make his own choices. Small thing, huge difference. "What do you do now?" Victoria asked after the waiter left. "For work." "I'm an interpreter. Medical and educational settings mostly. Pay is terrible compared to finance, but I get to use ASL every day and I can adjust my schedule around Marco. Worth it." Victoria processed this. A man who'd walked away from a lucrative career to learn his son's language and take a job that let him be present. Everything Victoria told herself was impossible, he'd done it, and he was sitting across from her in worn jeans reading a paperback, looking more content than Victoria had felt in years, despite her billions and her empire and her perfectly curated life. "Can I ask you something? Personal?" "Sure." "Do you ever regret it? Giving up your career, the money, the trajectory, all of it?" He smiled. "Every time Marco signs me a joke and I understand it, every time he tells me about his day in his own language, every time he introduces me to his deaf friends and I can actually talk to them, no, I don't regret it at all. I regret the 2 years I wasted trying to change him instead of learning from him." Victoria felt tears threatening and forced them back. She didn't cry. Crying was weakness, vulnerability, the opposite of the armor she'd built around herself. But watching Grace laugh with Marco, seeing her daughter be so completely herself, made Victoria realize what she'd been doing. She'd been protecting Grace from the world, when what Grace needed was for Victoria to bring the world to her. Dinner arrived, complicated plates of deconstructed cuisine that cost $40 and would leave you hungry an hour later. Marco and Grace barely noticed, too absorbed in their conversation. But Victoria noticed when Grace signed something that made Marco's eyes go wide. He signed back, emphatic, and Grace shook her head, her small face suddenly sad. "What are they saying?" Victoria asked Ethan. Ethan hesitated. "Are you sure you want to know?" "Yes." Marco asked Grace if she goes to deaf school, if she has deaf friends. Grace told him no. She said, Ethan paused, choosing words carefully. She said her mom keeps her separate because being deaf is embarrassing. Victoria felt like she'd been physically struck. "That's not... I never said that. I never told her..." "You didn't have to say it," Ethan said quietly. "Private dining rooms, avoiding crowds, probably private schools where she's the only deaf kid, right? Maybe a mainstream classroom with an interpreter who follows her around like a shadow. Grace learned what you believe about deafness from how you act, not from what you say." "I was protecting her," Victoria whispered, "from stares, from judgment, from people who wouldn't understand." "You were protecting yourself," Ethan corrected, not unkindly, "from being the mother of a disabled child in public, from having to explain, to advocate, to be different by association. I did the same thing. It's easier to hide than to fight." Victoria wanted to argue, wanted to defend her choices, explain her reasoning, but watching Grace's face, seeing her daughter sign about loneliness and isolation to the first deaf child she had ever met, made the truth impossible to avoid. She'd spent 6 years teaching Grace that being deaf was something to hide, and Grace had learned the lesson perfectly. "I'm a terrible mother," Victoria said, her voice cracking despite her best efforts. "You're a scared mother," Ethan said. "There's a difference. You can change scared. Terrible is harder to fix." The waiter returned, clearing plates. Marco and Grace had barely touched their food, too absorbed in conversation. Victoria realized she didn't even know what Grace had ordered, because she'd ordered for her daughter without asking. Another small way she'd been controlling instead of empowering. "Marco," Ethan signed, his hands fluid and confident, "ask Grace if she wants to come to the Deaf Community Center with us next Saturday. There's a kids' game day, lots of deaf children her age.
Marco signed to Grace. Victoria watched her daughter's face transform, hope and uncertainty and desperate longing all at once. Grace looked at Victoria, and in that moment, Victoria saw what she'd been missing all along. Grace didn't need protection. She needed permission. Permission to be death. Permission to be herself. Permission to exist in public without apology. "Can I, Mom?" she signed. And Victoria realized with a sharp pang that Grace had defaulted to English word order. ASL for hearing people, not the full complex language of the deaf community. Because that's what Victoria had taught her. Deaf people adapted to hearing people, never the other way around. "Yes," Victoria signed back. "Yes, sweetheart, we'll go." Grace's smile could have powered the city.
Monday morning, Victoria sat in her office overlooking San Francisco. Floor-to-ceiling windows, custom furniture, the kind of space that announced power before you said a word. Her assistant had arranged her schedule with military precision. 8 a.m. board meeting, 10 a.m. investor call, noon lunch with the CFO to discuss Q4 projections, 2 p.m. interview with TechCrunch, 4 p.m. strategic planning session. No space for community centers, no time for Saturday game days, no room for learning ASL fluently instead of just functionally. Her phone buzzed. A text from Ethan. "Marco wanted me to send this to Grace." Attached was a video. Marco signing an elaborate story about a dragon who was scared to breathe fire. Victoria understood maybe a quarter of it. She called her assistant. "Emily, I need you to find me an ASL tutor. Private lessons, intensive schedule. I want to be fluent in 6 months." "Of course, Miss Ashford. Should I schedule them around your current commitments?" Victoria looked at her calendar. Every hour blocked, every day maximized, every minute optimized for productivity. She thought about Ethan taking a 6-month leave to learn his son's language, about Grace's isolation, her loneliness, her belief that being deaf was embarrassing in public. She thought about private dining rooms and controlled environments, and 6 years of teaching her daughter to hide. "No," Victoria said. "Clear my Tuesdays and Thursdays, block them off completely, and find me information about deaf community centers in the area. I need to know where to take Grace on weekends." Emily's silence spoke volumes. Victoria Ashford didn't clear her schedule. Victoria Ashford worked 80-hour weeks and bragged about it in Forbes interviews. Victoria Ashford had built a billion-dollar empire by being relentless, ruthless, always on. Victoria Ashford was also failing her daughter. "Miss Ashford, you have the Chen acquisition closing next month. The board won't approve." "The board doesn't get a vote on my parenting," Victoria interrupted. "Make the changes." But the board did get a vote, as Victoria discovered 3 hours later, when Patricia Lawrence, chairwoman and majority shareholder, appeared in Victoria's office unannounced. "What's this I hear about you taking Tuesdays and Thursdays off?" Patricia demanded. She was 73, had made her fortune in semiconductors in the 80s, and treated vulnerability like a communicable disease. "We're in the middle of critical negotiations. You can't just—" "I'm learning ASL," Victoria said flatly. "My daughter is deaf. I've spent 6 years being present for this company and absent for her. That ends now." "Your daughter has nannies, therapists, private schools, everything money can buy. You're the CEO of a billion-dollar company. You have responsibilities to shareholders, to employees. You can't just check out because you're feeling maternal." Victoria felt the old instinct to defend, to minimize, to promise that Grace wouldn't interfere with work. But she thought about Ethan, who'd walked away from a finance career to be present, about Grace's isolation, her loneliness, her belief that being deaf was embarrassing in public. She thought about private dining rooms and controlled environments, and 6 years of teaching her daughter to hide. "Grace doesn't have everything money can buy," Victoria said quietly. "She has a mother who doesn't speak her language, who keeps her isolated because I'm ashamed to have a disabled daughter in public, who prioritizes board meetings over bedtime stories because I've convinced myself that financial success is the same as parenting. She doesn't need another nanny. She needs me. Actually me, not just my money."
This is emotional. Patricia dismissed. "You're not thinking clearly. Take a week, get yourself together, then we'll discuss." "I'm taking Tuesdays and Thursdays," Victoria interrupted. "Permanently. I'm also implementing new policies at Ashford Technologies, accessibility accommodations, deaf culture training for all employees, ASL classes offered during work hours. We're going to become the most deaf-friendly tech company in Silicon Valley." Patricia stared at her. "This will cost millions. And for what? To accommodate a handful of deaf employees we don't even have yet?" "To build a company my daughter could work at someday. A place where being deaf isn't a barrier, where signing in meetings is normal, where accessibility isn't an afterthought. I built Ashford Technologies to prove I was worth something. Now I'm going to make it worth something to Grace." "The board will fight you on this," Patricia warned. "Let them try. I'm still majority shareholder. And I'm done pretending that corporate success matters more than being a decent mother." After Patricia left, furious, threatening, promising board votes and shareholder rebellions, Victoria sat in her office and cried for the first time in 6 years. Not because she was scared of losing her company, but because she was terrified of the years she'd already lost with Grace. Her phone buzzed again. Another video from Ethan. Marco teaching Grace a sign for brave. Grace was laughing, repeating the sign, her whole face lit up with joy. Victoria realized what she'd been missing all along. Success wasn't the corner office or the billion-dollar valuation. Success was having a daughter who felt brave enough to be herself. And that success would require Victoria to be brave enough to change.
Saturday morning, Victoria drove to the address Ethan had sent. A modest building in a working-class neighborhood nowhere near the tech corridor where Victoria spent her days. The parking lot was full of minivans and sensible sedans, none of the Teslas and BMWs that filled Ashford Technologies' garage. Victoria had dressed carefully. Jeans. Designer, but jeans nonetheless. A simple sweater, flats instead of heels. She was trying. But she caught her reflection in the car window and realized she looked exactly like what she was, a wealthy woman cosplaying as normal. Grace didn't care. Her daughter was vibrating with excitement, signing questions faster than Victoria could follow. "How many kids? Will Marco be there? What games? Can I stay all day?" "I don't know, sweetheart," Victoria signed back, her ASL still clumsy and slow. "We'll find out together." Inside, the community center was loud, chaotic, wonderful. 30 deaf children ranging from toddlers to teenagers, their hands flying in conversation, their faces animated in ways hearing people rarely matched. Parents and siblings signing with varying levels of fluency, interpreters facilitating games, and an energy, a sense of belonging and community and utter normalcy that made Victoria's throat tight. This was what she'd kept Grace from. Not to protect her daughter, but to protect herself from feeling inadequate, from being the hearing mother in a deaf space, from having to admit she didn't understand, didn't belong, couldn't control the environment. Ethan appeared immediately, dragging Grace toward a group of kids playing some elaborate signing game that Victoria couldn't follow. Grace looked back at Victoria once, checking permission, making sure it was okay, and Victoria signed, "Go, have fun," which earned her the most beautiful smile. Ethan found her standing awkwardly by the door. "First time? That obvious?" "You standing like you're waiting to be attacked," Ethan observed. "Relax. Nobody here cares that you're Victoria Ashford, billionaire CEO. They care if you're willing to learn and respect deaf culture." "I don't know deaf culture. I don't know anything. I've spent 6 years forcing Grace to adapt to my world instead of trying to understand hers." "So, start understanding now," Ethan said simply.
He guided her toward a group of parents, hearing and deaf, who were setting up snacks. This is Victoria, Grace's mom. First time at the center.
The introductions were a blur. Names Victoria immediately forgot. Conversations she could barely follow because everyone was signing, and she was still so slow. But nobody made her feel stupid. Nobody judged her for being 6 years late to learning her daughter's language. They just welcomed her, corrected her signs gently, and kept including her in conversations even when she had to ask people to repeat themselves 3 times. A deaf woman, Julia, Victoria eventually learned, approached with her teenage son. "Your daughter, Grace?" Julia signed, and Victoria understood that much at least. "Yes." "Beautiful signer, very expressive. How old?" 7. Julia's eyebrows raised. 7? And signing that well? You must have started young. Victoria felt shame burning. "No, I've been focused on speech therapy, mainstreaming. She just met another deaf child for the first time last week. I've kept her isolated. I didn't know better." Julia's expression softened. "Hearing parent?" "Yes." "It's hard," Julia signed. "Hearing parents often don't know deaf community exists. Doctors, therapists, they push speech, cochlear implants, integration into hearing world. They forget deaf world exists, that it's rich, full, complete, that deaf children need deaf role models, deaf friends, deaf culture. Not just hearing people trying to fix them. I didn't fix her. I just made her feel broken." "But you're here now," Julia pointed out. "That matters. Grace will remember that you showed up, that you tried, that you changed." Victoria watched Grace across the room, her daughter in the center of a group of deaf children, signing animatedly, completely at ease in a way Victoria had never seen. Grace wasn't the odd one here. Grace wasn't the child who needed accommodation, who required special treatment, who was different. Here, Grace was just Grace. Deaf, yes, but surrounded by other deaf children who shared her language and her experience. Here, Victoria was the different one. The one who didn't understand, who needed help, who was learning to adapt. The reversal was humbling and necessary. Ethan appeared at her elbow, handed her coffee. "How you doing?" "Overwhelmed," Victoria admitted. "Realizing how much I don't know, how much Grace has missed because I was too proud to admit I needed help." "You're here now," Ethan said, echoing Julia's words. "That's what matters." They stood in comfortable silence, watching the children play. Victoria noticed Ethan's worn jeans again, his faded t-shirt, the way he'd driven up in a Honda Civic that was at least 10 years old. This man had walked away from financial success to be present for his son. And he didn't seem to regret it at all. "Can I ask you something personal?" "Sure." Do you ever feel like you made the wrong choice? Like maybe Marco would have been better off if you'd kept the high-paying job, could afford more opportunities, better schools? Marco needed a father who could understand him more than he needed private school, Ethan interrupted gently. Money can buy a lot of things, but it can't buy the feeling a child gets when their parent signs them a bedtime story in their own language, when their parent can talk to their deaf friends, when their parent makes them feel like being deaf isn't something to overcome, but something to be proud of. Victoria felt tears threatening again. "I've spent 6 years buying Grace everything except what she actually needed." Then stop buying and start being. Be present. Be willing to learn. Be brave enough to be bad at something in front of your daughter. Grace doesn't need a perfect mother. She needs a mother who tries.
The emergency board meeting was called for Monday afternoon. Patricia had rallied support, 7 board members who opposed Victoria's proposed accessibility initiatives, who saw them as expensive virtue signaling, who believed that accommodating deaf employees was a distraction from maximizing shareholder value. Victoria had spent Sunday preparing her presentation, not apologizing, not compromising, making the case that accessibility was good business, that deaf talent was untapped talent, that Ashford Technologies could lead the industry in inclusion and profit from it. But standing in front of the board, watching their skeptical faces, Victoria realized something. She didn't care if this made business sense. She had spent 6 years making decisions based on profit margins and quarterly earnings. It had made her successful and miserable in equal measure. "I'm implementing comprehensive deaf accessibility at Ashford Technologies," Victoria said without preamble. "ASL interpreters in all meetings, deaf culture training for all employees, hiring initiatives targeting deaf software engineers, designers, project managers, and I'm creating a new C-suite position, Chief Inclusion Officer, dedicated to ensuring our workplace is accessible to everyone." This will cost millions. For what? To accommodate a population that isn't even represented in our current employee base? To build a company my daughter could work at. A place where signing in meetings is normal, where being deaf isn't a barrier to advancement, where accessibility is standard, not special treatment. This is personal, not professional. You're letting your relationship with your daughter cloud your business judgment. My relationship with my daughter is making my business judgment clearer than it's ever been. I've spent 6 years prioritizing this company over Grace, building an empire while neglecting the person who actually matters. And I'm done. I'm still committed to Ashford Technologies' success, but success now includes being a company that values people over just profit. If you implement these changes against board opposition, we'll call for a vote of no confidence. We'll remove you as CEO. Victoria felt the old fear of losing her company, her identity, the empire she'd built from nothing. But she thought about Grace at the community center, surrounded by deaf friends, completely herself, about Ethan, who'd walked away from financial success to be present for Marco, about 6 years of private dining rooms and controlled environments, and teaching her daughter that being deaf was something to hide. "Then call the vote," Victoria said calmly. "Because I'm implementing these changes regardless. If the board wants to remove me from making Ashford Technologies more accessible, that tells me everything I need to know about whether this company deserves my leadership."
The room was silent. Then Patricia stood. "We'll take this to a vote. All in favor of removing Victoria Ashford as CEO." 4 hands went up, 7 stayed down. Victoria remained CEO. Barely, but she remained. After the meeting, several board members approached her privately, asked if she was sure about this, if she understood the financial implications, if she'd really thought this through. But one board member, James Chen, whose company Victoria had just acquired, pulled her aside with a different question. "My grandson is deaf," James said quietly. 8 years old, brilliant kid. And every tech company we've approached for future internships, for programs, for opportunities, they all have excuses. Accessibility is expensive. Deaf employees need too much accommodation. We're not set up for that. I've watched my daughter fight for every scrap of inclusion for her son. And I've wondered, what kind of world are we building if we tell deaf children they don't belong in tech? "A terrible one," Victoria said. "That's why I voted to keep you. Not because the accessibility initiatives make financial sense, though I think they will eventually, but because you're willing to build a company that sees Grace, that values her, that tells her she belongs. That's the kind of leadership we need." Victoria felt something shift in her chest. Maybe she wasn't alone in this. Maybe there were other parents, other leaders, other people who understood that profit and people didn't have to be mutually exclusive. Maybe she could build something that mattered to Grace and succeeded in the market. Both together.
Victoria's ASL was still far from fluent, but she could follow most conversations now, could sign with Grace without constantly asking her to repeat, could understand when Grace signed about her day, her friends, her feelings.
The Ashford Technologies Accessibility Initiative had been featured in TechCrunch, praised by disability advocates, and attracted remarkable deaf talent. 3 deaf software engineers, a deaf UX designer, a deaf project manager who was revolutionizing how the team communicated. And Ethan Wright, newly appointed Chief Inclusion Officer, who'd left interpreting to help Victoria build what she'd envisioned, a tech company where deaf employees weren't accommodations, but assets. He sat in her office now, still wearing jeans, still somehow making a C-suite position look casual, reviewing the latest hiring reports. "We've had 200 applications from deaf candidates," Ethan reported. "Word spreading that Ashford Technologies is actually accessible, not just performatively inclusive. This is working, Victoria." "It's working because you made it work," Victoria corrected. "I had the idea, you had the expertise." They'd been dancing around each other for 6 months. Professional boundaries that felt increasingly artificial. Moments where Victoria caught herself noticing the way Ethan signed. Fluent, confident, beautiful in its precision. Times when she thought she saw him looking at her with something beyond professional respect. But they'd kept it careful, appropriate, because Grace and Marco were becoming inseparable friends, and complicated adult emotions couldn't risk that. "Grace's teacher called me yesterday," Victoria said. "She said Grace is teaching ASL to her hearing classmates at lunch, started an informal signing club. The teacher asked if I'd come speak to the class about deaf culture." "Are you going to?" "Terrified to, but yes," Victoria admitted. 6 months ago, I would have said I was too busy, would have sent a nanny or a check instead of showing up myself. But Grace asked me to come. Actually asked, signed the request herself. I'm not missing that." Ethan smiled, and Victoria felt that flutter again, the one she'd been ignoring, suppressing, pretending didn't exist. "You've changed a lot," Ethan observed, "since that dinner at Lunar." "You changed me," Victoria said, then immediately wished she could take it back. Too honest, too vulnerable, too much acknowledgement of what was building between them. But Ethan didn't retreat. "You changed yourself. I just showed you it was possible." The moment stretched. Victoria was acutely aware of the space between them, 3 feet of office air, professional distance that could be closed in a single step. She'd spent 6 months wondering what it would be like to kiss him, wondering if he wondered the same thing. Ethan. Victoria. They both stopped, laughed nervously, and then Victoria's assistant knocked, breaking the moment, announcing Victoria's next meeting. Ethan stood, gathering his reports. "We should probably talk," he said carefully, "about whatever this is, or isn't, or might be." "I don't know what this is," Victoria admitted. "I've spent 6 months learning to be a better mother. I haven't had time to figure out what I feel about—" She gestured helplessly between them. "Then take your time," Ethan said. "I'm not going anywhere. And whatever this becomes, friends, colleagues, something more, it starts with Grace and Marco. They matter most." "They matter most," Victoria agreed. And she meant it. Whatever was building between her and Ethan, attraction, affection, maybe something deeper, it had to be secondary to what mattered. Grace's happiness, Marco's stability, the friendship between 2 deaf children who'd found each other. But that didn't stop Victoria from noticing the way Ethan's hand brushed hers as he left. Didn't stop her heart from skipping. Didn't stop her from wondering if maybe someday there could be something more.
Victoria requested the same private dining room at Lunar, but this time for different reasons, not to hide Grace from the world, but to celebrate. Grace was 8 now, confident and happy in ways that made Victoria's chest ache with gratitude and regret. Gratitude for the present, regret for the years lost. Marco was 10, still Grace's best friend, still teaching her new signs and deaf culture and all the things Victoria was learning alongside her daughter. And Ethan. Ethan was there in a suit that actually fit, looking uncomfortable in formal wear,
but smiling as he signed to both children about the restaurant's ridiculous menu descriptions. Deconstructed Caesar salad, Ethan signed with mock seriousness, which means lettuce in a fancy pile with sauce on the side. Both children giggled. Grace signed back something that made Marco snort with laughter, and Victoria caught most of it, a joke about fancy restaurants being places where you paid more for less food. She's not wrong, Victoria signed, her ASL now fluent enough to keep up with most conversations. Not perfect, still hearing accented, but functional and improving. But tonight is special. We're celebrating. Celebrating what? Marco signed. Ashford Technologies just signed our biggest accessibility contract. A tech giant, one of our competitors actually, hired us to help make their entire platform deaf accessible. Because we're now known as the company that does inclusion right. That's amazing, Ethan signed. It's because of you, Victoria said. The systems you built, the culture you created. You turned my good intentions into actual change. Ethan shook his head. You built this. I just helped. They had been doing this dance for a year, professional respect that bordered on something more, attraction that neither had fully acknowledged, a relationship that was something beyond friendship but neither had defined. Because defining it felt risky, because Grace and Marco's friendship mattered most, because Victoria was still learning to be a present mother and didn't know if she had space for romance. But tonight, watching Ethan sign with both children, seeing how he'd become part of their lives, Victoria felt the truth settling into certainty. This man, this single father who'd given up financial success to learn his son's language, had changed everything. Had shown Victoria what actually mattered. Had helped her become someone Grace could be proud of. Maybe it was time to acknowledge what that meant. After dinner, after the children had devoured dessert and been given tablets to play on, Victoria signed to Ethan, "Walk with me?" They left the kids with Victoria's security detail because some CEO habits died hard, and walked through the restaurant district. Festive lights strung between buildings, the December cold biting but not unbearable. 1 year ago, Victoria said, speaking and signing simultaneously the way she'd learned to do, I brought Grace to that restaurant to hide her from the world. And you crashed our private dining room and changed everything. I didn't crash it, Ethan protested. The restaurant double-booked. You know what I mean, Victoria said. You showed me what Grace needed, what I've been denying her. You helped me become a better mother. You did that yourself. Stop deflecting, Victoria said, turning to face him. They had stopped under a streetlight, snow beginning to fall, the moment feeling cinematic in a way that made Victoria self-conscious. I'm trying to tell you something, and you keep redirecting credit. Because I don't want you to think you needed saving, Ethan said quietly. You didn't. You needed permission to change, permission to prioritize Grace over corporate success. But you gave yourself that permission. I just showed you it was possible. You showed me it was worth it, Victoria corrected. That walking away from profit to be present was not just possible, but better. That Grace mattered more than quarterly earnings. That... She paused, gathering courage. That love was more important than empire. The word hung between them. Love. Not romantic love, not yet explicitly, but love nonetheless. For children, for connection, for choosing presence over productivity. Victoria, Ethan said carefully, are we still talking about Grace? I don't know, Victoria admitted. For a year, I've been focused on being a better mother, learning ASL, joining the deaf community, restructuring my company around accessibility. And you've been there through all of it, teaching me, supporting me, making me laugh when I was drowning in guilt. And I don't know when it shifted from gratitude to something else, but it has. Something else, Ethan repeated. Something else, Victoria confirmed. And I don't know what to do with it, because Grace matters most, and Marco matters most, and I don't want to risk what we've built, this friendship, this co-parenting partnership, whatever this is, for something that might not work. Ethan stepped closer. Snow was falling on his dark hair, melting on his shoulders, and Victoria had never seen anyone look more real, more present, more opposite of every polished tech executive she dated before. What if it does work? Ethan asked quietly. What if choosing love doesn't mean risking what we've built? What if it means building something more? I don't know how to do that, Victoria admitted. I've spent 41 years measuring success in dollars and market share. I don't know how to measure success in whatever this is. You measure it in whether Grace is happy, whether Marco is happy, whether you're happy. Those are the only metrics that matter. Are you happy? Victoria asked. I'm terrified because you're Victoria Ashford, billionaire CEO, and I'm a former financial analyst turned interpreter turned inclusion officer. Because our kids are best friends, and if we mess this up, we risk their relationship. Because I've been falling for you for a year, and I don't know if you feel the same or if I'm misreading professional partnership for something more. Victoria felt her heart hammering. You're not misreading. No? No, Victoria confirmed. I've been falling too. Slowly, carefully, trying not to acknowledge it because acknowledging it meant risking everything. But Ethan, you taught me that risk is worth it, that choosing connection over safety is how you actually live instead of just existing. So I'm choosing. I'm choosing to risk. I'm choosing to tell you that this, whatever this becomes, matters to me. It matters to me too. They stood there, snow falling, the city alive around them, a year's worth of careful distance finally acknowledged. Victoria didn't know what came next, didn't know if this would work, if they could navigate romance alongside co-parenting, alongside professional partnership, didn't know if billionaire CEO and interpreter turned inclusion officer could build something real. But she knew she wanted to try, because Ethan had taught her the most important lesson. Success wasn't measured in quarterly earnings. It was measured in whether the people you loved felt seen, heard, and valued. And for the first time in 41 years, Victoria felt all three. The Ashford Technologies annual gala was held at the same hotel where Victoria had announced the company's IPO 7 years ago. But this year, the event was different. Fully accessible, ASL interpreters stationed throughout, visual announcements on screens, deaf employees featured prominently in presentations, and Victoria on stage, not in Armani this time, but in an elegant dress with open sleeves that allowed for signing, presenting the first annual Ashford Inclusion Award. This award recognizes individuals who've made accessibility and inclusion not just policy, but practice, Victoria signed and spoke simultaneously, her ASL now fluent enough to be elegant. Who've shown that deaf talent, blind talent, disabled talent, all talent makes companies better, and our first recipient exemplifies this. She gestured to the side of the stage where Ethan stood with Marco and Grace, now 10 and 12 respectively, both dressed up, both watching their parents with identical expressions of pride. Ethan Wright transformed Ashford Technologies from a company that talked about accessibility to a company that lives it. And he did it by insisting that deaf culture wasn't something to accommodate, but something to learn from. That accessibility benefits everyone, not just disabled employees. That inclusion makes us stronger. Ethan accepted the award, signed his thanks to the crowd, then added something that made the deaf employees in the audience cheer. The best part of this job is making my son proud.
showing him that deaf people belong in tech, that signing in boardrooms is normal, that his father's work makes the world better for kids like him and like Grace. Grace beamed from the side of the stage. Marco signed something to her that made her laugh. And Victoria realized this was success. Not the billions in the bank, not the market valuation, but this. A daughter who felt proud of her deafness. A company that valued all employees. A partner who taught her what actually mattered. After the gala, after the speeches and awards, and the carefully catered dinner that Victoria had made sure included dietary accommodations for everyone, the four of them, Victoria, Ethan, Grace, and Marco, stood on the hotel balcony overlooking the city. "Remember Lunar Victoria signed to Grace 2 years ago?" Grace nodded. "When I met Marco, when everything changed." "What changed?" Victoria asked. "You changed," Grace signed simply. "You learned to sign. You took me to the deaf center. You stopped hiding me. You became my mom. Not just the lady who paid for things, my actual mom." Victoria felt tears threatening. 2 years of intensive ASL study, of joining the deaf community, of restructuring her company and her life and her priorities. And it came down to this. Her daughter finally feeling seen. "I'm sorry it took so long," Victoria signed. "I'm sorry I hid you. I'm sorry I was scared." "But you changed," Grace repeated. "That's what matters. You chose me. You chose to learn. You chose to be brave."
Ethan's hand found Victoria's. They'd been together for a year now. Carefully, slowly, making sure Grace and Marco came first. No rushing, no grand gestures. Just steady, consistent choosing each other while prioritizing the children. It wasn't a fairy tale. It was better. It was real. "What are you thinking?" Ethan signed with his free hand. "That 2 years ago, I took Grace to a restaurant to hide her," Victoria signed back. "And you crashed our dinner and saved us both, showed me what actually mattered, taught me that success isn't measured in quarterly earnings." "How is it measured?" Ethan asked. Victoria looked at Grace and Marco, both signing to each other, both happy, both thriving in a world that was slowly becoming more accessible because people like Ethan insisted it should be. "By whether the people you love know they're loved," Victoria signed. "By whether your daughter feels proud instead of hidden. By whether you show up. By whether you choose connection over control." "And have you?" Ethan asked. "Chosen connection?" "Every day," Victoria signed. "For 2 years. And I'll keep choosing it, because you taught me that walking away from profit to be present wasn't sacrifice. It was the smartest business decision I ever made, and the best personal one." They stood there, 4 people who'd found each other in a restaurant 2 years ago, who'd built something real from corporate policy and personal transformation, who'd proven that accessibility wasn't just good ethics, but good business. Watching the city lights and signing in comfortable silence, Victoria had built an empire. But this family cobbled together from a double-booked dining room, was her greatest achievement. Not because it made her money, but because it made her whole.